Hi. So thank you very much for coming. And this is the second installment of the Late Qing series that we've been talking about. Late Qing, obviously, is the period between 1840, when China was the first time having a war with the European power, Britain, lost, up until 1911, which was the end of the Qing dynasty. And so previously, on the Late Qing, we know that the British had invaded or fought with China. China lost, and lost in a really, really bad manner. I mean, in terms of statistics, the British only had about 10 to 20,000 soldiers against 200 to 300,000 soldiers from China. And the casualties were 69 Brits died, and about 20,000 Qing soldiers died. And so it was really a massacre. And China had to cede Hong Kong. That's why Hong Kong had been a British colony. And so now we're in a situation where, okay, we're in the Second Opium War. So China's door has been opened the first time. But it wasn't opened enough. So therefore, with the Second Opium War, we're going to talk about the Second Opium War, and also the main character of the Late Qing period of China is going to be introduced today. The main character, this person of the 70 years of the Late Qing, this person ruled for 47 years, 47 of the 70 years. What's interesting is this person, she had two lines that were favorites. The first one was, if whoever makes me uncomfortable for a minute, I will make sure that he or she will be uncomfortable for the rest of his life. The second line of her famous lines is, whoever causes me to lose face, I'm going to make sure that he's going to lose his life. So this lady, obviously, is the Empress Dowager. And so today we're going to introduce this main character of the period and how she came to power and ruled China for 50 years. And so in the beginning, first, I want to talk about what was the reaction within China to the loss in the First Opium War. Because obviously, if you fought with a bunch of people that had cannons and guns that were about 200 years more advanced than yours, there should be a huge uproar or some kind of reflection on why these guys are so good. So what was the reflection that happened in China right after the Opium War? In short, nearly absolutely nothing. Nobody saw it as any kind of cause. They only thought that these British people, these white Europeans just came. They had these voodoo type of things called technology that beat the crap out of us. But there were a few people who really saw things really beyond. And one of them would be a guy called Xu Jiyu. He actually took all the imperial exams in China. And so, like for most people, it was actually a very confusion. But then, because he was actually the governor of the province of Fujian, he got to meet with a lot of American missionaries, and he asked a lot of questions around the world. And he actually wrote a book called Yinghuan Zhilue, which translated in English would be like the booklet for countries around the world. And basically, and there were a lot of really interesting insights. Remember, this is a guy who had studied only Confucian texts. And by the conversations he had with the Europeans, he actually made out these certain conclusions. And his book was published in 1846. Some of the conclusions were, the closest thing to the conception of heaven on earth is Switzerland. Switzerland has the closest kind of cooperation kind of system within the rest of the world. And what's another interesting thing is, and actually his comments about Washington, it's still actually in Washington, D.C., he actually compared Washington with the best emperors in the prehistoric age of China, and said that Washington was a guy who could have been king in America, but he didn't. And he used the system of, he called basically democracy, or the recommendation system, which is very similar to the old days of Yu and Tang Yu. And saying that he actually even predicted that, like, because America, think about it, in the 1840s, it was not the greatest power. in the world. He said, okay, this system, eventually, America will come to dominate the rest of the world. So he had the ability to actually predict that. But the problem was, actually, his book, that guy was actually later demoted for being too sympathetic with the British settlers in his city, in Fujian. And partly it's because of his book. His book, the biggest problem with his book was that it found, basically, people found out that China was not geographically the center of the world. And so there was a huge uproar against his book, that how dare you say that China is not geographically the center. So in some sense, it's very similar to, he was actually named by the New York Times as the Galileo of China. So in some sense, he's very similar in the sense that the worldview, the worldview of the Chinese scholars at the time was that China was in the middle of the world. And everybody was were culturally inferior to China. He basically, even though he was a Confucian scholar, he basically revolutionized the idea. But nobody took notice, or nobody wanted to take notice, because if you have to understand the political system of China, you know that it's basically ruled by bureaucrats who have taken the exams, of the Confucian exams. And in order to agree with Xu, the Galileo of China, you would have to overthrow everything that you've learned. And basically the whole political regime, the legitimacy of the regime. That's why China, if you look at, it's always too slow to reform in China, in late Qing. That's why we lost repeatedly. And because the thing is, because it's all about interest groups. And the biggest ruling interest group in the Qing dynasty or in any of the old Chinese dynasties were the Confucian scholars. And if you have to refute the Confucian thinking, it's basically refuting their own belief and refuting their own legitimacy. And so there was huge resistance against any movement that says, oh, actually, we need to learn from outside. Because that immediately takes away the legitimacy of the regime. So it's actually, in some sense, it's really sad because the book that he wrote about the rest, introducing China to the rest of the world, because the Chinese language and Japanese language were much closer, it was actually then translated into Japanese. And in terms of selling per capita, is about 600 times higher in Japan than in China. And the Meiji Restoration, one of the texts, the main text was actually Xu's book. That's so Meiji Restoration used Xu's writings to strengthen Japan, which caused then the Sino-Japanese War, the Second Sino-Japanese War. So in some sense, it's actually one of the saddest, most tragic things where it was a Chinese person who did all the research on the rest of the world, but it was then given to the Japanese. So in some sense, to conclude this section, China had no reflection. And China had no reflection. Most importantly, I think it's important because as we talk about late Qing and any kind of Chinese history, the most important thing, and to understand modern China and development modern China, is to understand the distribution of special interest groups. And you can see the whole of the late Qing, why we repeatedly were defeated in war, and how come our progress was so slow, was because the special interest group that was the biggest was the Confucian thinking. And to take that away took about 70 years. That's why this period of history is 70 years. And so without any reflection, we need to talk about the change in regime. So, or the change in ruler. So during the First Opium War, the emperor who lost was Emperor Daoguang. Daoguang then died in 1850. And so in 1850, it was a new emperor, Xianfeng. Xianfeng took over the throne. And we talk a little about, actually this section is quite important, especially for people who are in family businesses who need to deal with other siblings. And that is when Daoguang was old, actually he had a son, really early on he had a son. He had a son that was quite rebellious. And one day, the son was so rebellious that, the teacher was actually quite mad at the son and said to the son, you know what? One day you're going to be emperor. So if you don't study hard enough, how can you be emperor? And then his first son said, Daoguang's first son said, you know what? The day I become emperor, I'm going to kill you. So, and then the teacher was so scared. So he talked to the Emperor Daoguang. Emperor Daoguang was furious. So he told a few eunuchs to beat his son with a stick. And afterwards, he says, like, no, don't beat him. Not because he was lenient, but because like he's scared that the eunuch might be too soft on him. So he got his son to come over, and he kicked him in the groin. And the son then died in 3 days. And he was actually quite sad. And then so he didn't have any further kids until when he was 50. And so in the 1840s, we had two sons who were particularly smart. The fourth son, Yi Zhu, and the sixth son, Yi Xin. And then Yi Xin, the sixth son, Yi Xin, were actually more talented, very talented. Yi Zhu is very introverted, is very nice, very soft. But then Yi Zhu was the oldest at the time, even though he was the fourth son, he was the oldest at the time. So who would he give the throne to? The kind and soft person, or the competent and bright person? And so there were different stories, partly true, and sometimes it's actually stories. There was like he actually went to go hunting. He went to go hunting, and the sixth son, the brighter one, was substantially stronger in physique, and so he killed a lot of animals. Like he killed like a lot of animals. But the fourth son, he was bad. He was like physically, he was a lot worse than the sixth son, Yi Zhu. So he didn't kill anything. He didn't even try. And then so when the tallying, when the marks were scored, it was like, oh, how come like your younger brother is like 16 under par, and you didn't even fire a shot? He said, it's around the springtime, and if we do kill animals, we would kill the animals, and then the babies will suffer. So by losing that game, he won with his kindness. And then another story, which I think is extremely relevant, especially in family feuds, is this. So his father was about to die. And when his father was about to die, he asked his two favorite sons separately to come and meet him. And he asked the sixth son, Yi Xin, first. He was very sick, and Yi Xin, and he asked him, I'm about to die. How are you going to rule the country? What are you going to do in these different steps? And Yi Xin was like, okay, okay. In military, I'm going to do this. In finance, I'm going to do this. In management, I'm going to do this, and this, and this. And then the emperor, the old emperor, was like, oh, you're actually really smart. You're actually really good. But oh my God, you actually have everything thought out for the preparation of my death. And then he asked the fourth son, the nicer but dumber guy, Yi Zhu. Yi Zhu was substantially less smart than his younger brother. So his teacher told him, you know what? You're never going to be as smart as your younger brother. So you have to play the hard game. And so when the old father asked Yi Zhu, I'm about to die. What are you going to do when you're emperor? He just cried and said, I'm going to use my life in exchange for your life. Because I don't want you to, your life is more than me. And so in this instance, the old emperor then gave the throne to the fourth son, the less talented person, but with a kinder heart than the more talented person. But that also showed that the whole court at the time had very little idea about what's really happening to the world and what's really happening to China. Because usually the rule is if the period of history is dangerous, you give it to the competent guy. And if it's the period of peace, you give it to the nicer guy. So in that sense, he had no conception, or that's a reflection that he had very little conception of the danger that China was facing. But so in 1850, the new emperor, the young new emperor, was not the talented, bright person who smoked cigars and drank whiskey. Actually, because he was number 6, he was actually called Gui Zi Liu, which means that Ghost 6, because he was actually really westernized. He loved clocks, he drank whiskey, and he smoked cigars. But it was given to a very conservative, kind, introverted, silent man, the fourth son, who is the Emperor Xianfeng, which also meant that the country did not progress.